I was born and raised in a small town on the border between Nevada and Arizona. My entire life, you could say, unfolded in the semi-desert and mountainous areas where winters were damp and cold, and summers unbearably hot. But there was always a certain magic to this land. The cascade of stars in the night sky, crimson sunsets over the hills, and the vast waters of Lake Mead stretching for miles. For tourists, the lake was just a spot for fishing or boating. But for us locals, it was something more, a natural and familiar presence, as intrinsic as the yard of our house or the street we walked to school on. Our town is small where everyone knows each other. The streets are deserted by 8 in the evening, and on weekends the locals gather in cafes or bars to chat about the latest news. Sometimes it feels like time here is frozen in the past century. Old motels, neon signs that haven't changed since the 1970s. But the lake, Lake Mead, remains the true gem, drawing in tourists and adventurers alike. When I left for the big city to attend college, it felt like I'd escaped the grip of provincial life. But a few years ago, after a series of personal setbacks, I returned. At first glance, not much had changed in my hometown. The same low houses, a couple of gas stations along the highway, and the 24-hour supermarket near the turnoff to the lake. Some childhood friends had moved away, replaced by a few new faces. Locals now, in every sense of the word. One winter day, when the cold wind whipped through the region, I got caught up in a story that began as a series of small oddities and ended... Well, to be honest, I still shudder when I recall those events. I want to share it to exercise these eerie memories and to warn anyone who might consider camping near the lake during the cold season of rain and biting winds. At the time, I was temporarily out of work and surviving on odd jobs. An old high school acquaintance, Macy, offered me a gig at a lakeside bar as an assistant. It was a small side job, just a few hours a week. Serving drinks, clearing tables, helping in the kitchen. I agreed without much thought. The bar was situated right on the lake's edge, about 50 yards from the water. It mainly catered to fishermen and hunters. In summer, it was crowded, but in winter there were often just 2 or 3 customers at most. That day, I finished my shift by evening, wiped down the counter, closed the register, and helped Macy with inventory. Outside, the biting wind swept down the empty road, scattering tufts of last year's grass and sand. When I stepped out of the bar, the air was cold and sharp, and the dim outline of the docks by the lake was barely visible in the half-light. The silence was absolute. No motor hum, no voices. Just the creaking of metal structures and the whisper of the wind. I glanced back. Macy stood in the doorway, wrapping her warm cardigan tightly around herself, watching me leave. She seemed like she wanted to say something, but stayed silent. In the dim light of the bulb above the bar's entrance, I caught a glimpse of unease on her face. Or maybe I just imagined it. I got into my car and slowly drove home. For most people, home means cozy streets and brightly lit supermarkets. But here, it's a narrow road skirting the barren outskirts, with a few dim streetlights that barely illuminate where the asphalt ends and the rocky, rugged ground begins. When I reached the trailer I was renting, I parked and carefully stepped around a muddy puddle. Snow or sleet is rare here, but in winter we often get cold, torrential rain and gusts of wind that cut right through you. Opening the door, I noticed someone had left a newspaper outside. Strange, since I hadn't subscribed to anything, and the local mailman rarely delivered papers like this. I picked up the hefty bundle, mostly advertisements and something called the County News Bulletin. My eyes skimmed the headlines. Missing tourists, power grid outages, police urge caution on roads. I didn't bother reading the details. Too many similar reports had piled up in recent months. As I ate a quick sandwich, my mind drifted back to recent conversations. Rumors were flying. Someone mentioned a missing fisherman swept away by the current. Others spoke of strange footprints on the sandy shore of the lake's far edge. I dismissed it as local folklore, the kind of small-town storytelling that thrives on fear. The scarier the story, the faster it spreads. I had more immediate concerns. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a mental note to ask Macy about the disappearances the next day. And with that, I slipped into unconsciousness, unaware of the terrifying events that lay ahead. I woke up to a knock at the door. The faint light of dawn barely crept through the window, and the clock read just past 6 in the morning. I was sure it was some sort of mistake, but the knock came again, this time louder. Reluctantly, I got up, pulled on a t-shirt and pants, and shuffled toward the door, trying not to trip in the narrow space of the trailer. When I opened it, I found Chief Barron standing on the porch, the local police chief. Around 60, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and a piercing gaze. When I was a teenager, he'd occasionally catch me and my friends for minor mischief, like riding mopeds without helmets or sneaking beers behind the school. Rumor had it that he could look the other way if it benefited the town's reputation. "Morning," said the chief with a crooked smile. "Woke you up? Sorry about that." "It's fine," I muttered, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "What's going on?" The chief tried to maintain a polite demeanor, but I could see he was tense. He asked if I'd heard anything strange during the night. Screams, howls, gunshots, or the sound of vehicles. I shook my head. I'd slept like a log. He didn't go into detail, only asking me to stay in town for the time being and steer clear of any trouble. As he walked back to his car, I noticed the radio clipped to his belt crackling faintly, likely broadcasting police codes. Any trace of sleep vanished. I got dressed, brewed some coffee, and decided to get an early start to the day. Questions buzzed in my head. Why had the chief come to see me? Why was he asking about screams and howls? My eyes drifted to the stack of papers from the county news bulletin that I'd ignored the night before. Who would have thought I might need to dig through it for something important? Still, I had plans to help Macy with some old speaker repairs at the bar today. Her equipment had been acting up for weeks, and as a former electrician, I'd offered to take a look. Besides, my curiosity was itching. I wanted to hear what rumors were swirling around the bar. Half an hour before opening, I pulled up to the bar. Inside, everything was just as usual. The faint smell of cheap coffee, faded posters on the walls, and a wooden counter polished to a shine. Macy sat at one of the tables, flipping through a pamphlet, nervously bouncing her leg. "Morning," I greeted. "Oh, hey, Joel," she replied, forcing a smile. "How was your night?" I hung my jacket on a chair and noticed the room seemed darker than usual. Some of the lights weren't working. Macy, meanwhile, looked uneasy. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "Not bad, all things considered," I said. Though, Chief Barron showed up at my door at 6 this morning, asking if I'd heard anything strange. "Everything okay with you?" She gave me a look, as though debating whether to tell me something. Finally, Macy nodded toward the window and spoke quietly. "Out here, by the bar, dogs were howling all night. Except, they weren't dogs. The sound was different, like something bigger. Every time I heard it, I got chills. It felt like it was right outside, you know? But I was too scared to look. I just sat and waited for the sun to come up." I frowned. She was clearly shaken. I tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just coyotes or a large dog that had escaped someone's yard. After all, this was the desert. Wildlife was close by, and strange sounds weren't unusual. But Macy just shook her head. "I don't know. What I heard was—" She paused, searching for the right words. Louder, deeper, and angrier. I suddenly recalled Chief Barron's questions, and something inside me churned uneasily. Still, there was work to be done. I grabbed my tools and set to work on the speakers, but the tension in the air lingered, as if the very space around us was saturated with unease. While I was busy with the wiring, Harry, a fisherman and avid hunter with a broad face and a gruff voice, walked into the bar. He ordered coffee and, despite the early hour, a shot of whiskey. Harry was always talkative and loved to gossip about the town. "Did you hear what happened over at Red Rock Cove?" he asked, sipping his coffee. "They found another one of those missing tourists. Or what was left of him." My hands froze midair and Macy frowned deeply. Nobody wanted to delve into details, but Harry seemed to relish building suspense. "The body was torn to shreds," he continued, shaking his head, like some big animal got to him. "Dogs? Wolves? Wolves! I've lived here all my life, never seen a wolf around these parts. Coyotes? No way they get that big." I studied his weathered face, trying to figure out if he was exaggerating or lying. But Harry looked deadly serious. "Hell of a thing," he muttered. "Of course, you won't hear about it on the news. They don't want to scare off the tourists. But this is the second time this month." Cautiously, I asked how he knew the details. Harry tapped his radio, the kind hunters often carry, explaining that the frequencies sometimes overlap with police communications. "I overheard the cops talking about the body," he said. "They said the flesh was torn up with some kind of claw marks. They're trying to cover it up now, calling it a coyote attack or some unfortunate accident." "Yeah, right. Who's buying that?" "But listen, kid," he added, leveling a stern look at me. "Keep your mouth shut, or Chief Barron will come down on you like a ton of bricks." With that, Harry slapped the counter, downed his whiskey, and left the bar, leaving Macy and me in oppressive silence. My mouth went dry from the tension. This had to be connected to the disappearances the papers mentioned. Still, rumors spread like wildfire in small towns, and facts were always sparse. Later that evening, with the bar nearly empty, I decided to look up old news reports online. Maybe I could find something about these disappearances. Even online, the information was sparse. Unidentified tourist body discovered near Lake Mead. Authorities are investigating. That was it. No details, no theories, and as if the universe wanted to mess with me, I heard strange howling in the distance that same night. It sounded like a wail, but too deep and resonant, with a vibration that seemed to reach my bones. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, evoking a primal, inexplicable fear. I strained to listen, trying to convince myself it was a truck on the highway, or maybe a distant siren. But the howling persisted, with occasional pauses, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Macy suggested I stay the night in one of the bar's back rooms. She admitted she was too scared to be alone. Honestly, I wasn't eager to walk the dark road home alone either, so I agreed. We locked up the bar, bolted the doors, and I settled onto an old couch in the dimly lit room. It seemed innocent enough, but a cocktail of anxiety and curiosity churned inside me. That night, I dreamt of nightmares. I usually sleep soundly, but I found myself walking along the edge of a pitch-black lake. The water was unnervingly still, and suddenly, I noticed a massive shadow gliding across its surface. Yellow eyes flickered, and something in the darkness grinned at me. The dream ended abruptly, and I woke up with goosebumps from the cold. The bar's heating wasn't doing much against the chill. I lay there staring at the ceiling when I heard it. A faint scratching sound outside. It was quiet but persistent, like something clawing at the wall. My heart skipped a beat. I strained to listen, convincing myself it might be the wind. But the noise continued, moving along the wall toward the back door of the bar. Cautiously, I grabbed a flashlight from the counter. The beam of light cut through the dark like a blade as I tiptoed to Macy, who was dozing in one of the chairs. I gently shook her shoulder. "Hey, wake up," I whispered. "I think there's someone or something outside." Her eyes shot open and she stared at me, wide-eyed. We quickly turned off the dim lights to avoid drawing attention and listened. The scratching persisted, but the unsettling part was how it seemed deliberate. Like whatever was out there was circling the building, brushing against the walls and shutters. "Maybe it's just an animal?" Macy whispered. I wasn't eager to step outside and find out, but the uncertainty was maddening. My grip tightened around the metal flashlight as if it could actually protect me. I walked quietly, pressing my ear to the walls, heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my temples. And then the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, crushing in its intensity. Macy and I exchanged a glance in the darkness. Her eyes were wide, like a cornered animal's. Minutes passed, or at least it felt that way, before I mustered the courage to peek through the slit in the curtain, covering one of the back windows. I looked out. No rain or snow, just the wind kicking up scraps of leaves and debris. Nothing unusual, except in the spot where the fence should have been, I saw something large. It stood on its hind legs, a hulking silhouette against the faint glow of the bar's light. The dim beam revealed fur, a massive torso, limbs that were something between arms and claws, and a pair of dull, glinting eyes. They seemed to be staring right at me. I flinched, and in that instant the figure was gone, melting into the darkness as if it had never been there. For a moment I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew what I'd seen. Macy caught the look on my face and whispered, "Did you see it?" "Not sure," I lied, my voice trembling. "But there was something, or someone." We both knew our sense of safety had been shattered. And though we didn't dare step outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was fully aware of us, and was watching. After that night, Macy and I started paying more attention to our surroundings. I tried to convince myself that it could have been a person in a heavy coat or a large coyote, though no large coyotes were known to roam the area. For a couple of days, we were on edge, but no new incidents seemed to occur. Meanwhile, the police were searching for another missing person, a young man reportedly filming a video on the shores of the lake for his blog. One evening at the bar, I ran into Bobby, the local recluse. He lived near the far dock, in a shack that had once been his father's house. Bobby rarely came around people, usually keeping to himself. But that night, he ordered a beer and sat at the counter, drumming his fingers on the mug. We got to talking. As usual, it started with fishing, the weather, and rising grocery prices. But when I mentioned the strange disappearances, Bobby's face twisted into a grim expression. "Don't go digging into this, kid," he muttered, draining his mug. "Best to stay out of it." "Why?" I pushed. "People are going missing. Shouldn't we try to figure out what's going on? I'm sick of all the rumors." "Rumors?" He smirked bitterly. "These rumors have been around for decades. Let me tell you something. There's things in these parts better left undisturbed. You ever hear about the curse of the old mines? About what went on there back in the 20s? I shook my head. The mines were real enough. abandoned tunnels carved into the rocky hillsides where ore was once extracted. No one ventured into them anymore since they were mostly collapsed and considered dangerous. Old folks used to say a miner, a crazy fanatic, performed sacrifices down there. To some dark gods, shamans, or whatever. Supposedly he'd been cast out by his tribe, and his curse still lingers over the lake. They say on moonlit nights, something not quite human, not quite animal roams these parts. A werewolf, a wolf demon. Call it what you want. Sounds like nonsense, huh? But years ago, people went missing, mostly outsiders. And every time, they'd only find scraps of bone and torn flesh. A chill ran through me. I didn't believe in tales of wolf demons, but the strange sounds, the missing tourists, that shadowy figure behind the bar, it all started to form a disturbing picture. You didn't hear? Bobby continued, furrowing his brow. Last month, when the first tourist disappeared, there was the same cold wind blowing. That same night, folks heard howling. Then someone spotted giant wolf tracks near the mines. But there's no wolves in these parts, so who knows what it was? He fell silent, and the quiet was deafening. I gripped my water glass tighter, trying to moisten my dry throat. I wanted to dismiss it all as urban legends, but the words stuck. Bobby was sharper than I'd given him credit for. "If you want to keep your peace of mind," he said, rising from his seat, "stay away from the old mines and the wild shores. This ain't Vegas. The cops will handle it. If they can." With that, he left, leaving me in stunned silence. I watched him go, thinking about how quickly ordinary life could turn into a horror movie. Curses, werewolves, strange rituals, seriously? But then again, I'd seen that shadowy figure, heard the howling, felt my chest tighten with fear. While I was still processing everything, we had another disturbing incident. Jack, an old schoolmate who now worked as a mechanic at the town's only auto shop, went missing. His truck was found by the roadside the next morning, the doors flung open, keys still in the ignition, and signs of a struggle everywhere. Claw marks on the door, and bloodstains on the seat. When news spread, the townsfolk withdrew even further. Chief Barron urged everyone to remain calm and not give in to panic. But in reality, the atmosphere was suffocating, the air itself heavy with fear. I remember sitting alone in the bar that evening, wiping down glasses in an attempt to distract myself. Macy approached me a few times, gently touching my arm and asking how I was, but there was nothing to say. Images swirled in my mind. Jack's abandoned truck, that eerie howl, Bobby's story about the curse, and most of all, the sense that something real, alive, and dangerous was stalking our town, and we had no idea how to deal with it. Macy cautiously suggested, maybe we should do something together. Form a group of locals to search the areas where people are disappearing. "I've thought about it," I sighed, "but Chief Barron would probably shut it down. He's already warned me not to stir things up. And people are scared. Who's going to volunteer to wander through abandoned mines at night?" She nodded, understanding. Suddenly the phone rang, making us both jump. It was Mrs. Randall, an elderly woman who lived on the outskirts near the foothills. She complained about strange noises in her barn and said she was too afraid to leave her house. Macy covered the receiver with her hand and looked at me, her eyes questioning. I shook my head. "Tell her we'll pass it on." By the time Macy got back to the phone, Mrs. Randall had already hung up. It was odd. She'd called to report something alarming and then abruptly ended the conversation. We called the police, but they only responded with their usual, "We'll get to it when we can." Classic small-town policing. Limited resources, mounting panic. The next day, I realized that losing my sanity to fear seemed easier than finding a rational explanation for everything happening around me. Yet I decided to act. I had an old camera with a decent night mode, a leftover from my college days. I figured I'd use it to capture something, anything, if it decided to show itself. That evening, after my shift, I headed to the far side of the lake, where the howls were most often reported. I traveled light, the camera, a flashlight, and a warm jacket. Macy wanted to come along, but I told her no, it was too dangerous. Twilight deepened as I walked along the damp sand, the lake's cold moisture seeping into the air. Pebbles crunched beneath my boots, and the wooden planks of the old docks groaned faintly by the water's edge. There wasn't a soul around. I could hear my own breathing, and with each step, a question echoed in my mind. What the hell am I doing playing the hero? But I had to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind, and that this werewolf was nothing more than a collective town delusion. I walked the shoreline, nothing unusual. Climbing a small hill for a better view of the area, I saw the faint glow of the sporadically working streetlights near the road. It was as if someone had dimmed them on purpose, heightening the eerie atmosphere. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint, acrid stench of decaying vegetation from the lake's depths. I froze when I heard the snap of branches nearby. I turned on the camera, aiming it toward the shadows in the brush. The sound stopped. Then, a distant howl pierced the air, making my heart plummet. It was exactly as Macy had described, deep, guttural, and painfully mournful, as if ripped from something that shouldn't exist. The sound seemed to come from the hills near some old, abandoned structures. My legs moved before my brain could catch up. I walked toward it, starting and stopping the camera, hoping to capture the sound at the very least. My hands trembled so badly that I was afraid I'd drop the equipment. When I reached a low structure made of weathered wood and rusted sheets of metal, what must have once been a worker's shack, a chilling sensation enveloped me. In the flashlight's beam, I saw fresh claw marks gouged into the walls, deep enough to splinter the wood. A torn piece of fabric lay on the ground, stained with something dark and dried. Blood, most likely. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I crouched to inspect it. Then behind me a branch snapped. I whipped around, aiming the flashlight toward the sound. At first all I saw were bushes swaying in the wind. But then, in the beam's periphery, two glowing yellow eyes stared back at me, and a hulking figure crouched on its hind legs. Something that looked like a wolf, but was far too large to be any natural animal. It wasn't just looking at me. It was assessing me like it was deciding whether or not to attack. I froze, barely daring to breathe. My vision swam as fear took over. Time seemed to stretch infinitely in that moment. Then the creature let out a low, guttural growl and stepped forward. I saw its long claws, its twisted humanoid frame cloaked in matted fur. It was something impossible, a hybrid, neither man nor beast. Werewolf, my mind screamed, though the rational part of me protested at the absurdity. But everything the locals had said flooded back, and I couldn't deny what I was seeing. I took a shaky step backward, then another, all the while keeping the creature in sight. Its glowing eyes shifted to the camera, the faint, blinking light of its recording function reflecting in the darkness. And then, without warning, it lunged forward with inhuman speed, letting out a deafening roar that reverberated in my chest like a physical blow. I don't remember exactly how I started running, only that I nearly dropped the flashlight in my panicked scramble. I stumbled over rocks and roots, adrenaline propelling me as the creature's howl echoed behind me, blending with the roar of blood pounding in my ears. When I finally reached my car, it felt like I'd been running for hours. I glanced back. Nothing was following me. But in that moment, I thought it was over. My heart raced wildly, and the metallic tang of fear lingered in my mouth. I dove into the driver's seat, started the engine with shaking hands, and peeled onto the road, speeding away from the nightmare I couldn't believe I'd just survived. Whatever I had encountered was real, and it was far worse than anything I could have imagined. I was shaken when I arrived at the bar and found Macy closing the register. The moment she saw me, she gasped. Clearly, I looked like someone who had narrowly escaped death. I was trembling and couldn't form coherent sentences. Finally, I managed to choke out. "It's real. It's not coyotes. I saw it." Macy quickly grabbed my hands and sat me down at a table. I took a few deep breaths and recounted everything I'd seen. The massive silhouette moving on two legs, the glowing yellow eyes, the guttural, inhuman growl. "Damn," she whispered when I finished. "So the rumors are true? It's really some kind of werewolf? Or some mutated animal?" I didn't know how to answer. All I knew was that any logical explanations I'd clung to before were now completely out the window. We sat in silence for a moment, trying to process what this meant for us and for the entire town. Suddenly, my phone rang. I flinched. The screen lit up with Chief Barron's number. I couldn't imagine why he'd be calling me at this hour, but I answered. His voice was hoarse and tense. "Joel, I need you to come down to the station. It's important. Bring Macy too. I know she's there with you." Macy and I exchanged a glance. How did he know we were together? But Chief Barron had been in this town long enough to have an uncanny sense for these things. "All right, we'll be there," I said. When we arrived at the station, we found Harry, the fisherman, already there. He claimed to have seen something prowling near the shore that evening and had snapped a few photos on his old phone. The images were blurry, but the outline of something large and dark against the moonlight was unmistakable. Harry looked like he'd aged 10 years since I last saw him. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he clutched his phone. The chief asked us to confirm whether what Harry saw matched what we'd experienced. When I looked at the photos, a chill ran down my spine. The silhouette was eerily similar to the creature I had seen. Macy bit her lip and nodded, silently affirming that it matched our description. "Damn it," the chief muttered, clearly unnerved. "I hate this kind of mystical nonsense, but hell, we can't just ignore this. You all need to keep your mouths shut about this, understood?" But his words didn't match his face. He was clearly scared. Whatever this thing was, it didn't fit into his orderly view of the world. Harry suggested organizing a hunt for the beast. He talked about gathering a group of brave men with rifles to sweep the areas where it had been spotted. I hesitated at the thought. Going up against something like that seemed suicidal. Yet the primal instinct to protect myself and those I cared about wrestled with my fear. If we didn't do something, more people would disappear. Taking a deep breath, I asked, "Chief, what do you think?" "Technically, any vigilante activity is illegal," he said, locking eyes with me. "But if we don't do something, there's going to be another torn-up body by morning. I can't believe I'm saying this, but we don't have a choice." It was decided. We'd gather at midnight and head to the old mines, where the howls were most frequently heard. Volunteers would bring cameras, flashlights, and weapons. The chief emphasized that this was just a sweep of the area. If it turned out to be an animal, it needed to be put down. And if it was something else, well, that needed to be dealt with too. We set out as a group of 6, me, Macy, Harry, 2 other local hunters, Steve and Dan, and Chief Barron himself. The night was unusually clear, with the full moon hanging overhead, casting a silvery glow over the landscape. Despite the stillness of the air, a heavy tension hung over us. It felt as though the world itself was holding its breath, anticipating something terrible. The old mine was about 2 miles northeast of town, nestled at the base of a steep cliff. The road leading there was rough, and it took us 40 minutes to navigate it in 2 off-road vehicles. We kept the headlights dim to avoid spooking the creature, though my hands gripped the wheel tighter with every mile. I had been there alone not long ago, and the memory of what I'd seen made my skin crawl. As we arrived, the area around the mine greeted us with an eerie silence. No calls of night birds, no rustle of leaves, just oppressive stillness. We divided tasks. Harry and Steve took the lead with flashlights and rifles, while Macy, Chief Barron, and I brought up the rear. The mine entrance was a gaping black maw in the cliffside, flanked by rusted rails and abandoned carts overflowing with debris. The air reeked of damp earth and rot, as if something had been decaying deep within for years. "Stay together," Chief Barron ordered in a low voice. "No one goes off on their own. If you see anything, don't panic." We nodded and moved cautiously toward the entrance. The closer we got, the colder the air seemed to grow. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach as Macy gripped her flashlight like a lifeline, her knuckles white with tension. Suddenly, a howl erupted from within the mine, loud, guttural, and otherworldly. The sound was so piercing that we instinctively dropped to the ground. It came from deep inside, reverberating through the cavernous opening. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging through my veins as I fumbled with my camera, desperate to start recording. Some part of me clung to the idea of capturing proof, though my hand shook so badly I could barely keep it steady. Harry raised his rifle, aiming toward the dark tunnel. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, from the shadows, it emerged, a massive, wolf-like figure. The moonlight illuminated its monstrous form, broad shoulders covered in patchy dark fur, a head that was undeniably wolfish yet disturbingly human, and glowing yellow eyes filled with malice. Its mouth opened, revealing long, jagged teeth that gleamed in the silver light. "Oh my God," Macy whispered, her voice trembling. Steve fired the first shot, but the creature moved with astonishing speed, leaping sideways to avoid the bullet. It radiated raw power, and its deep, guttural growl almost sounded mocking. Chief Barron shouted, "Aim for the legs!" But before anyone could react, the creature lunged forward, knocking Steve to the ground. His scream was cut short by a sickening crunch that froze the blood in my veins. Harry, paralyzed for a moment, finally pulled the trigger. The shot seemed to graze the beast, but it only enraged it further. With a feral roar, it turned on him, closing the distance in an instant. Harry was thrown against a pile of rocks, his body crumpling on impact. Whether he was alive or dead, I couldn't tell. I grabbed Macy's arm and pulled her behind a large boulder as Chief Barron fired several shots in quick succession. The muzzle flashes briefly illuminated the creature's snarling face. It was both beast and man, a grotesque hybrid of the two. But then I heard a guttural groan and the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Chief Barron had been struck. My heart hammered in my chest. Was this how it ended? Were we all going to die in this cursed mine? The creature loomed over us, its eyes gleaming with a predatory intelligence. It growled low, almost as if savoring its victory. Macy clung to me, trembling, and I knew we had to act. But the beast stood between us and the exit, leaving no clear path to safety. "Stay close to me," I whispered, though my voice was barely steady. Before the creature could advance, it suddenly paused, its ears twitching. It turned toward the mine's other entrance, as if sensing something else. The distant wail of sirens cut through the silence. Someone had called for backup. The beast growled, seemingly irritated, and bolted toward the shadows with inhuman speed, disappearing into the darkness. Seizing the moment, I helped Macy to her feet and we rushed to the exit. We avoided looking at Steve's motionless body, though the sight of him lying there would haunt me forever. Harry was still slumped against the rocks, unmoving. Chief Barron was conscious but badly injured, clutching his side as blood seeped through his uniform. Macy and I hauled him to his feet and half-carried him toward the vehicles, driven purely by survival instinct. As we emerged into the open air, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind us. The creature was chasing us. My heart sank as I turned to see its massive form bounding on all fours, closing the distance with terrifying speed. But just then, the sky was lit up by flashing red and blue lights. Police reinforcements had arrived, and powerful searchlights sliced through the night, illuminating the beast. It roared in frustration, shielding its eyes from the blinding light before darting back into the shadows, disappearing among the rocks. We dragged Chief Barron to the nearest truck. Harry and Steve were left behind in the mine, their fates grimly certain. My chest tightened as the weight of our failure sank in. The creature had outsmarted and overpowered us at every turn. The hunt was over, and the wolf demon had won. The next 24 hours were a nightmare. The police cordoned off the area around the mine. Paramedics arrived and took Chief Barron to the hospital, and Macy and I gave our statements. But the skepticism on their faces was hard to miss. They said things like, "It must have been a large animal, maybe a mutated coyote." But we held our ground. This was no coyote, no bear, not that bears even lived around here. We'd seen something else, something that defied explanation. Rumors spread like wildfire through the town. Some spoke of a giant wolf. Others dismissed it as mass hysteria. I started noticing how people acted like nothing had happened, even though their tense glances and hushed conversations betrayed their fear. After surgery, Chief Barron regained some strength and ordered that the details be kept under wraps. The official story was a tragic accident at the mine caused by a wild animal. The deaths of Harry and Steve were chalked up to a cave-in or some other natural event. Meanwhile, the police combed the surrounding area but found no trace of the creature. It seemed to have vanished into the network of tunnels beneath Lake Mead, or it was simply lying in wait. Macy and I struggled to cope with the aftermath. My nights were plagued by nightmares of a massive wolf stalking the shoreline, leaving bloody paw prints as I stood paralyzed with fear. Macy often cried, blaming herself for dragging me into the bar job. After all, that's where this nightmare began. But I knew there was no one to blame. We were just victims of a force far beyond human comprehension. Weeks passed and the town settled back into a veneer of normalcy. There were no more missing tourists, and the newspapers moved on to other stories. But if you paid close attention, you could see the changes. People stayed indoors after sunset. Fishermen stopped camping by the docks, and some even threw away their tents. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface of daily life. One night, unable to sleep, I stepped out onto the trailer's porch, lit a cigarette, and stared at the black sky. My mind swirled with the memories of what we'd seen, something inexplicable. Call it a werewolf, a wolf demon, or a curse tied to the old mines. It was real. It still roamed somewhere, haunting the hills and occasionally making its presence known with a chilling howl. Nobody knew when or if it would strike again. Maybe in 6 months, maybe a year, maybe never. But one thing was clear. Logical explanations couldn't touch what we had experienced. There was talk of a massive hunt, of bringing in specialists to track large predators, or even sealing off the mine entrances with explosives. But none of it materialized. The town carried on as best it could, living in quiet dread masked by routine. Sometimes late at night I'd see mist rolling over the edge of the lake, and within it, a fleeting shadow. Maybe it was just the play of light and wind, or maybe it was the embodiment of our collective fear. But I knew one thing for sure. That night at the mine, we encountered a true monster. Not a man, not a mutated beast, but something that lived beyond the boundaries of human understanding. It possessed immense strength, animalistic instincts, and a deep, seething hatred for humanity. As I write this, it's still hard to fully grasp the horror of what happened. I often ask myself, what if I hadn't run? What if Macy had been closer to the creature? What if Harry hadn't hesitated with his second shot? These questions have no answers. They only drag me further into despair. The only thing I can do now is keep going and be ready for whatever comes next. For now, there have been no new attacks. We pretend everything is fine. But every evening, as darkness falls and clouds obscure the moon, I find myself straining to hear. Every howl of the wind, every rustle in the bushes sends a chill through me. People insist it was just an animal or a collective hallucination. But deep down, I know better. This was something from another world, from the dark corners of existence, or maybe even a remnant of some ancient past. Someday, if we're lucky, we might find a way to stop it. Or perhaps it will vanish as mysteriously as it appeared. But more and more, I've come to believe that as long as this cursed spirit lingers in the mines, Lake Mead will never be a truly safe place. Anyone who dares camp there might fall victim to another wolf night. Macy has left for another state to stay with her relatives. Her trailer sits empty, and the bar barely operates during the quiet winter season. Chief Barron has recovered, but his face looks gaunt and weary. The confidence and authority he once exuded are gone. Rumor has it he plans to retire early. As for me, whenever I look out over the waters of Lake Mead, I can't shake the image of that monstrous silhouette, those massive fangs and eyes burning with rage. Sometimes I hear a distant howl and find myself trembling, dropping whatever I'm holding. Then I remind myself to keep moving forward, to live, to remember that beneath the calm surface of everyday life, darkness always waits for its moment to break free. If you ever find yourself here by Lake Mead and decide to take a moonlit walk, be careful. Listen for every rustle, watch every shadow. And if you hear a howl that doesn't quite sound like a coyote, run. Run as fast as you can, before you're caught in a wolf night from which there is no escape. And remember, there are no happy endings to stories like this because evil never truly leaves. It waits in the shadows, ready to return when you least expect it. No one knows exactly where it hides, but I know this much: it exists. And now, perhaps, so do you.